Hello and welcome back to another episode of a Cozy Christmas Podcast. My name is Art, and today I have a very special story. One thing I've been hoping to do this year is feature some more original stories written by authors or even you in my audience. If there's a budding author out there who would love to hear their story read on the podcast, let me know and we can discuss the details. But the story today is from my guest from earlier this week, Kevin Moore. He has just recently published a second volume of Christmas stories, and we talked about that in our last interview. Before we get to our stories, I do have a couple of announcements to make and some things you'll want to be aware of. Coming up next week, we're going to begin reading Christmas at Sugar Plum Manor. It's a novella by author Rosanna M. White. And that's for our Cozy Christmas Book Club. We're going to start reading that the week of November 18th. It's called a novella, but it looks like it has about 200 pages to it. So to me, that's a novel length, but we're going to read that over the next couple of weeks or so. I'm looking forward to discussing that with you over on the Facebook page of our book club, which you can find links to that page in the show notes. This is a Christmas romance set in the Edwardian era of England. It is inspired by the Nutcracker, and it weaves a magical tale of love and friendship at Christmas time. And I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I will be speaking with the author in an upcoming episode as well. I had a chance to schedule an interview with her, so I'm very excited for that. If you'd like to be a part of our book club, you can find us at the Cozy Christmas Book Club on Facebook, or send me an email at cozychristmaspodcast@gmail.com, or just reach out to any of the social medias that I'm on, and I will make sure to add you to our group. All right, another thing I would love to hear from you involving your recipes. I've shared a couple that I've worked on this year, and I have not yet heard from any listeners about recipes or anything about like that, because when I recorded all these, I did some batch recording. But go ahead and send those in. Shoot me an email, a text, whatever you can, to talking about what are your favorite Christmas treats. Do you have a funny story or a heartwarming story around one of them? Coming up in the next couple of weeks, I'll be interviewing author Tyler Mitchell, and he suggested to me a recipe that I'm going to try, and I cannot wait to tell you about it. I'll give you a hint. It involves Nutella and fresh baked bread. Well, actually, that's pretty much all that it involves. A really delicious treat that I can't wait to make at Christmas time this year. So you can send me your recipes or food ideas or funny stories involving food to cozychristmaspodcast@gmail.com. Okay. Today's story is an original story that comes from Kevin Moore's collection called Christmas Stories Volume 2. As I have talked about both volumes of his Christmas short story collections, I think they're a wonderful addition to your Christmas reading. The covers are cozy and beautiful, very Christmassy. And so today, to help promote his second collection, he is going to stop by and read a story for us. It's available right now on paperback, and it will be available on Kindle starting, looks like November 19th of 2024. The description on Amazon says, in this eagerly awaited follow-up to his #1 Amazon bestseller, Christmas Stories, 7 original short stories, Moore masterfully crafts a tapestry of unforgettable characters and heartwarming narratives that embody the essence of the holiday season. Journey with a young boy who creates a profound and mystical Christmas for his community, a woman who stumbles upon a mysterious pink gift card filled with unexpected surprises, and a troubled young man who hears the magical sound of snowflakes falling. Each story invites you on a path of self-discovery, love, and miracles. With a range of stories from heartbreaking to humorous, magical to everyday, Moore's protagonists experience profound transformations. They find hope, learn valuable lessons, and uncover the true meaning of Christmas, perfect for savoring by the fire or during life's daily journeys. This captivating collection reminds us that the magic of the holiday is real if we only open our hearts to it. So with that, I will turn things over to Kevin, and he'll read us his story.
Hi, this is Kevin Moore, the author of Christmas Stories, Volume 2. And I am about to read you one of the short stories. It's called The Rag Tag Sleigh Flyers. Henry had an uneasy feeling in his stomach, though this was nothing unusual. For years he had problems with his stomach whenever he was stressed. Today was the opening day of reindeer training, and Henry was the elf in charge of everything reindeer. Needless to say, his stomach was not at its best. Several old pros, including Prancer and Dixon, were already at the training area when Henry arrived. They belonged to the legendary first team, Santa's main crew. But every year on December 11th, Santa had an open camp for future sleigh flyers. Henry was always nervous on opening day, but his anxiety was palpable today. But as he watched Dancer, Dasher, and Comet gallop onto the snowy field with grace and power, he felt himself relaxed. That was until Donna walked sluggishly towards him. Henry loved his job. His previous position making toys did not bring him the joy that working with animals did. His goal had always been to be a veterinarian, and every stray animal in the North Pole, wild or otherwise, came looking for Henry when they were sick or hurt. His plans to be a veterinarian changed when Santa offered him the position of chief elf of the reindeer division. How do you say no to Santa Claus? It was such an important position, making sure Santa's sleigh flyers were healthy and fit for that miraculous one-day trip around the world on Christmas Eve. So when Donner approached sluggishly, Henry knew it was time to spring into action. "Hi, Donner. How are you?" Henry asked, hugging and rubbing Donner's back. "I'm not quite myself. I'm having trouble with my jumps and flying this week," Donner said. "Oh?" Henry asked, reaching for his Tums. These reindeer had been pulling the sleigh since the early 1800s if folklore was to be believed. And Henry believed. It was December 11th, so there was plenty of time to get Donner back in shape and ready for the big night. But it did feel like they were perhaps cutting it close. Examining Donner inside the great stable lifted some of his fears. Her legs, hooves, and overall anatomy seemed fine. However, whenever she jumped to fly for him, the height was good, impressive even. But it was not the kind of takeoff to the stars with a sleigh full of toys flight that would be required for Christmas Eve. Concerned, he tested her eyes, teeth, antlers, and a cognizance. Everything checked out fine. Still, the problem persisted. She couldn't fly. Millie watched Henry putting Donna through his testing. Millie was a cow. She was a cow that produced the most milk in Santa's village. She also knew and talked to most animals in the village. But Francis, a Clydesdale horse, was her best friend and confidant. Francis was always the first horse picked for parades and Christmas Day celebrations as the village waited for Santa and his team of reindeer to return from their Christmas Eve journey. Unable to find some physiological reason for the lack of flight, Henry wanted Donner to coach with him today, so no one would know her troubles. He thought the unthinkable when silently considering auditioning another reindeer for her spot. This broke Henry's heart, but he had to consider it. At the camp, everyone demonstrated their incredible speed, from the newbies to the B and C teams, and up to those established legends. The crew and the newbies and the B and C teams showed impressive speed. Minor jumps looked good, but were flat when they leaped to deliver some hang time. Henry stood up straight, pulling his shoulders back. This was supposed to be when the young male and female reindeers showed off and impressed the crew. But not today. After multiple starts and stops, Henry moved the A-team into position, except for Donner. To his dismay, it was more of the same. Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Dasher, and Blitzen were not taking flight. Like Donner, their jumps were sound but had no takeoff. Nothing like what Santa would need to fly a sleigh through every element known on the Earth's atmosphere. His stomach moved like an alien was trying to escape, and Henry took another Tums. "Great first day," he said in a shaky voice. "Let's do some stretching and start early tomorrow. I want the A-team here first thing in the morning, bright and early." Day 2 brought more of the same. Reindeer that had no serious hang time and very small patches of flight. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The recruits had even fewer abilities than the struggling Big 8. Henry knew he had to talk with the boss. Santa Claus came walking into the training site on the morning of day 3, trying not to make a fuss. But as you can imagine, Santa always drew a crowd, even in the village where he lived. Santa was the most recognizable man in the world, more famous than any rock star, movie star, king, or queen. Once the town, with its mix of elves, winter people, and animals, heard he was at practice, they came to see him, causing quite a commotion. People and elves were scattered across the roofs of the barn and nearby houses, trying to get a better look. Birds glided overhead, weaving through the air near practicing reindeer, while cows and horses bounced off each other playfully. Henry sighed, immediately calling over the public announcement system for our closed practice. But it was too late. Everyone began chanting, "Santa! Santa Claus! Santa!" from the perimeter of the arena. When he placed Henry in charge of the reindeer, Santa knew that he was the best, but also a little high-strung. And Henry would tell, by the way Santa spoke to him, that he thought Henry's nerves had gotten the better of him again. But when Henry had the recruits run, jump, and attempt to fly, not one of them had the Christmas reindeer flying power required to pull the sleigh into the air. He moved on to the B team and the C team, who delivered equally disappointing results. Henry watched Santa's face. For years, he had said they had so much depth with their reindeer that they had nothing to worry about. But now it was clear there was no substitute bench. Finally, the Big 8, Donner, Vixen, Prancer, Dancer, Dasher, Comet, Cupid, and Blitzen came in, and Henry had them go through the steps leading to flight. Yet again, it was a collective sigh of disappointment and worry from all the elves standing and watching to the birds in the trees, to Santa Claus himself. Santa left waving to the people, elves, and animals that made up the community. He needed to call an emergency meeting for later in the day. In the meantime, Henry set up his team to take blood samples from the reindeer in an attempt to find answers. How could the most incredible reindeer and sleigh flyers in the world lose their abilities to fly? Henry was befuddled. They all seemed so healthy, except they couldn't fly, which was, of course, the most important detail at this time of year. Henry accumulated all the blood samples and sent them to well-known universities and hospitals. Santa, Mrs. Claus, and Henry sat for a tense afternoon tea to discuss some alternative methods of getting those reindeer in the air. "Of course, there are times I have to sprinkle sleeping dust for the children too excited to fall asleep. But what you probably don't know is that I have a few different magical dusts. That includes reindeer flying powder." Henry instinctively gasped, wondering why Santa had failed to mention this any sooner. "I only had to use it once, way back in 1959. "I thought that was a myth, sir," Henry said. "Why, sir? Did you have to use it in 1959? "Well, it was a brutal ride. We were facing nor'easters on the East Coast, gale winds, hurricanes, fierce meteor showers, and a couple of the reindeer were having difficulty flying in the Moroccan desert heat. I had to sprinkle some dust in their drinking water. It got us back up in the air and we finished the trip." "And can I test it?" Henry asked. "Of course," said Santa. "It might be the only thing that will save Christmas." Mrs. Cross looked and said, "No flying reindeer. No Christmas. They all put their heads down in silent prayer, hoping and praying it would be the answer. Henry mixed the dust in the water trough, and all 8 reindeer drank excitedly. Cupid remembered 1959. I had no legs left, he said. The stuff worked like a charm. Fired up, they left the stable for the arena. Santa's flying dust was just what they needed to get back in the air. They were all sure of it. They all galloped as a team, running faster and faster, jumping in unison, ready for flight. But it did nothing. There was no takeoff. Yes, they did a nice jump, but there was no flying. The mighty 8 tried and tried until they were exhausted. The B and C group drank the water with the flying dust. Nothing. And then came the newbies, but the results were the same. The reindeer could not fly. As he watched the last of the newbies crash back to Earth, Henry's phone rang. It was Dr. Silver from Stanford University. Listen, Henry, I have some bad news. Santa sat sullenly in his big red chair. By his side sat 2 of the main elves in charge of business operations, each with a deeper scowl etched across their forehead. They waited for Henry to begin. The good news, Henry said, is that it's not fatal to the reindeer. The bad news is that it takes months to get over. And while infected, the virus reduces transferable skills. That, unfortunately, includes flight. I've never heard of reindeer flu, Santa said, rubbing his eyes. What do we do now? Santa's village was despondent. The birds whispered on the telephone lines. Cats, dogs, skunks, and raccoons huddled in corners. News spread through town that something was wrong. Something enormous. The balance of Christmas as they knew it was in jeopardy. Santa and his magical reindeer might need to cancel Christmas this year, which had never been done before. It's late in the game to try and get a contract with one of the delivery services, said the elf, looking over the electronic map covering one of the walls. What about drones, someone asked. You'd need tens of thousands of drones, said the elf in charge of operations. Santa, did you try the flying dust? I'm afraid it didn't work, Santa said apologetically. When morning came, Henry awoke to his stomach's usual war dance, letting him know there was much to worry about. Henry blamed himself for not having discovered the virus months ago, long before Christmas. He had no idea there was such a thing as reindeer flu. Still, after quickly getting ready and swallowing another dose of Tums, he went over to check on the reindeer, who were milling around with their heads hung low. Some of the big 8 were attempting to run, jump, and take off like it was all a bad dream they needed to wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. They still couldn't fly. Henry spoke with each reindeer, examining them to make sure none of them were feeling sick. They were so important to him and Santa Claus, whether they could fly or not. Henry walked in the snow, fixated on the potential humiliation of being the first elf in charge of the reindeer the year they canceled Christmas, when he saw the strangest thing. Millie, the slow-moving cow, was running and jumping like a prize horse. Henry stood with his mouth open and eyes bulging, as to his amazement, Millie left the ground and was flying. What's the matter? The cat got your tongue? Said Troy, the black cat. Henry looked down at the sarcastic feline and smiled. No one in the village knew how many lives a cat had, but they were sure Troy had more than 9. Do you see what I'm seeing? Henry asked, as Troy followed his eyes to Millie, who was jumping and flying around the field. Troy instantly went into a Halloween pose, with all his black hair standing straight up in the air. And if Millie flying wasn't enough of a hallucination, Frances joined her in the field, and the gigantic Clydesdale began running and jumping like a gazelle, all 2,300 pounds of him. And before Henry could process what had happened, the 2 of them in unison leaped into the air and flew together. Troy laughed hysterically at the sight of these 2 lumbering animals jumping, springing, and flying all over the large field. like God had given them wings. Of course, Henry knew it had to be the flying dust. He had poured it in the water in the stable for the reindeer yesterday. Millie and Francis confirmed his theory. They both drank the water yesterday before they knew what was in it, and decided to see if they could fly. This gave Henry an idea, but he had to run it past the big guy first. "They did what?" Santa yelled, unable to get his head around what Henry had told him. Troy, who was no scaredy cat, hid behind Henry as Santa roared, demanding to know how such a thing could happen. Together, the three of them went to the arena, turned on the night lights, and let a very nervous cow and Clydesdale horse show Santa Claus what they could do. Here, even Santa, who was used to miracles, stood gasping, with his left hand covering his mouth and his right hand pointing, as Millie and Francis hit wild hang times, flying high into the night sky. "Santa," Henry whispered, his eyes narrowing conspiratorially. "Don't even think about it," Santa said, holding his head high. His eyes locked on Henry's. Troy slid in between them, crawling on Santa's lap. "Don't you start," Santa said, petting him gently. His eyebrows fell in on one another as he tilted his head to the left. "Henry, don't get ahead of yourself. Do you know how difficult it is to fly a sleigh? Not to mention the weather. Meteor showers, spy balloons, space junk, and hostile governments that don't want their children to believe in Santa Claus. It's a pipe dream, Henry." Henry hung his head, disappointment sitting on him like an elephant. "Can we try?" Henry asked. "We have nothing left to lose." "We need a miracle," Santa said, getting up with the weight of canceling Christmas on his mind. Henry, Troy, Millie, Francis, and Donner stood whispering in the dimly lit stable like spies from the Cold War. "I can't pull a sleigh," Millie screeched. "I'm a cow." "We're getting ahead of ourselves," Donner said. "We first need a team of flyers." "I need you and Francis to talk to your herds, and if interested, they need to try the magic flying dust," Henry said. "Can you do it for me?" Henry, Troy, Donner, Francis, and Millie watched with bated breaths as the cows and Clydesdale horses drank from the trough. Several cows mooed, and the Clydesdales neighed as they walked languidly to the field. Millie worked with the cows, and Francis worked with the horses. Donner helped both herds with instructions and techniques. Henry paced, chewing his fingernails, with Troy on his shoulder. They waited and waited, but nothing happened. Neither the cows nor the Clydesdale gathered any speed, never mind a jump. Flying was a pipe dream, and both herds returned to their daily routines. Still, Millie and Francis were jumping and flying. It was clear the flying dust didn't work on every animal, but Henry had hoped there would have at least been enough between the cows and the horses to make up a flight team he could train. So instead, he returned to burying his book and researching antibiotics for the reindeer. Suppose he could find a cure in time for Christmas. Troy sauntered through the great library, with its walls of books, counting the many shelves he had napped on. He found Henry with a pile of books ranging from an ancient tome of natural herb remedies to the comprehensive book of medicine, and even a book on how to fly without wings. "Henry," Troy says, getting no response. "Henry?" "I'm sorry, Troy, I don't have time." Troy climbed over the books onto Henry's shoulders and eventually stood on his head. He looked into Henry's face upside down. "Oh, Henry, you have to see this. I'm not going anywhere. I need to find a cure for the reindeer flu. Just come to the window." "No." Troy gently shoved the books with his paw, knocking them off the table. "Just to the window," he said. Henry jumped to his feet, heated, and picked up the fallen books before marching to the window. "What?" he barked as Troy jumped on the ledge. "What do you see?" Troy asked. "I see a pig. Well, technically a hog. Looks like Corky." Troy stood up at the window like a conductor as Corky, a massive pig, ran, leapt, and flew past the second-floor window, heading deep into the night sky. Henry pressed his face against the glass, trying to see where Corky went, as Corky zipped by with the grace of a flying reindeer. Once again, they met in a clandestine setting. Henry, Troy, Donner, Corky, Millie, Francis, and Otis, the most beautiful snowy owl in the North Pole. Otis, Henry greeted him like an old friend. "It's been a minute. Henry, my good man, always a pleasure." "Yes, I heard about the reindeer troubles. It's been the talk of the forest." "I'm sorry, Donner. You are all legends. And I promise no one thinks less of you because you've caught some bug." Otis then looked at Henry. "How can I help you?" Otis returned to the forest with Henry's information about looking for recruits. Their next stop was Garbo. Garbo was the smartest, sassiest donkey on the planet and the leader of the drove. "So, I see you picked a pig before coming to see us," she said with a snort. Corky looked away, embarrassed. "Now, Garbo," Troy said, "no need to be rude." "I'm just stating a fact," Garbo said. "No offense, Corky." Before the tension could ratchet up any higher, Henry took out a pear. "You've come bearing gifts," Garbo said. "You know how precious a ripe pear is in December?" Henry asked. Garbo nodded. "And you know how much I love my pears, Henry." "We need your help," Henry said, hugging her. "I'm sure by now you have heard about our troubles," Donner interjected. "Yes, Donner. What a nightmare," Garbo said sincerely. Henry motioned for Corky, Millie, and Francis to run, jump, and fly as he told her the story. "Oh my," Garbo said, ears to the side, laughing and stomping. "Millie! Millie! You go, Millie girl!" Once the pig, the cow, and the Clydesdale were back on safer ground, Garbo couldn't contain her excitement. "What can I do?" Garbo asked, looking Henry straight in the eye. "Fly," Henry said. Garbo had all of the donkeys who drank the mixture get in line so that Donner could coach them one by one. They tried and failed miserably. No hang time, no speed, and no elevation. "I'm sorry, Henry," Garbo said, rapidly swinging her tail and slowly walking away. "Garbo," Henry called. She turned her head back to face him. "What about you? You need to go." "Oh, Henry, I don't think I can." "Of course you can. You work the railroads, rode tourists down the Grand Canyon and back up. People said you couldn't make it in the North Pole, and here you are, thriving." "Come on, Garbo. Let's show them what you got," Donner said. After a slow start, Garbo was hanging 10, running like a thoroughbred, and soaring like a prima ballerina. Her only issue was a hard landing. Henry and the crew greeted her with laughter and applause. "Oh my," Garbo screamed. "I was flying. Henry, flying!" Garbo yelled, bumping up against Henry, Donner, and Millie affectionately. She then let Troy jump on her back and whisper in her ear, "A sleigh flyer, Garbo. A sleigh flyer." Pedestrian traffic came to a screeching halt when Bartholomew, the original lone wolf, sauntered into town. He was the meanest, most brutal wolf in the forest. The animals all ran at the sight of him for fear of being lunch. Otis came soaring in with his snow-white feathers, wide wingspan, and sharp claws, an impressive sight in the winter sky. He landed next to Bartholomew and said something that made Bartholomew nod his head. Otis took off, flying over to Henry and Troy, the only ones left in the area, as all the other animals hid in fear. "Henry, Troy," Otis said, waiting for Bartholomew to arrive. "He's interested in a tryout." "You're not going to eat anybody, is he?" Troy said, licking his paws. "Well, I do hear that he loves pussycats," Otis said, which made Troy jump into Henry's arms before eventually settling on his right shoulder. Bartholomew was a large wolf, 7 feet long and 200 pounds. He sported multiple scars documenting his many battles. His reputation in the forest and why he left his pack was the stuff of myth at this point, and no one dared ask him directly for the story. Henry looked at the powerful animal. He was one of the few animals in the forest he had never met or seen. As Henry mixed the dust into the water bowl, the shaking of his hands and spilling of the magic solution gave way to his dance of nerves. He spoke directly to Bartholomew, but his head played the tune. "Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?" "Why would you want to do this? Be a part of a team," he said, his voice unsteady. He stared at Henry, licking his lips, and then at Otis. "It's personal," Bartholomew said. "Otis told me this drink might not even work." But it did work. The wolf, already fast, flew around the arena like none of the other previously did or could. His jumps were picturesque, and his flying was steady and robust. Henry, Troy, Otis, Donner, Corky, Garbo, Millie, and Francis stood in awe. "Practices every day," Henry told the wolf once he made it back to Earth. "If we're going to build a team to pull Santa's sleigh, which we're not sure we can do, we need to work hard, harder than we've ever done individually or collectively." Bartholomew looked around the team, stopping at Corky and licking his lips. "This is your team? A pig, a donkey, a cow, and a portly horse?" "I'm a Clydesdale," Francis said. "We're big-boned." Henry was in the midst of trying out several Siberian husky dogs who worked pulling sleighs. He had tried from the beginning to get them to try out, but up until now he was unsuccessful. Although all those dogs were incredibly athletic and powerful, only one could fly: Iman. He was willing to leave his crew to save Christmas. The 2 final spots were filled with the help of Otis. They were Kiki, a mountain lion, and Mishka, a hard-of-hearing polar bear. But a cocky mountain lion and a deaf polar bear were not whom Henry had in mind. But he was out of candidates in time. Anyone who knew anything about polar bears knew they were powerful predators and could be pretty vicious, which gave Henry pause. A wolf, a lion, and a polar bear. It sounded like the beginning of a bad joke. All hunters, they could be considered dangerous around the more domestic animals like Corky, Garbo, Millie, Francis, and Amon. Henry had to proceed cautiously. Henry utilized the legendary 8 to help train. He matched each reindeer with his or her potential stand-in this new team of flyers. Even just saying it sounded crazy. How do you replace the big 8? Was that even possible? Henry needed to map positions and see how the animals did being harnessed to a sleigh. Bartholomew, the wolf, and Iman, the Siberian husky, were used to pulling sleighs and natural leads, but before he could assign, Kiki's ego and pride got in the way of his abilities, and he wanted a chance at the lead. Relenting, Henry placed him and Iman in the front for a trial run. They got off the ground fine, but as they were coming to the top of the trees, Kiki closed his eyes. Iman pulled hard to the left, avoiding a collision. Let's try Bartholomew and Iman as lead flyers. Kiki behind Iman, Corky behind Bartholomew. Henry had doubts about Mishka's placement. The polar bear, red lips, and during training, he and Troy made sure they were able to see each other so she could talk to him. This would be trickier in the air. Mishka, you go behind Corky. No, Kiki. Corky, at the moment, was stronger than Kiki and followed instructions better. Garbo, behind Corky. Millie, behind Garbo. And Francis, you are behind Mishka. Henry explained why all positions were valuable and what was needed to excel at each. He then had a reindeer from the Big 8 work with them individually. Dasher and Dancer worked with Bartholomew and Iman. Prancer and Vixen worked with Corky and Kiki. Comet and Cupid with Garbo and Mishka. And Donner and Blitzen worked with Millie and Francis, teaching them how they would ultimately control landings and the weight of the sleigh at takeoff. "Do you see how important each of you is to the success of this adventure?" Henry said, standing at the top of the sleigh and looking at Kiki. "No one is more than. No one is less than. You will succeed together." Then Henry took them and the sleigh out for a spin as everyone in Santa's village and the woods looked up to see. Bartholomew and Iman nailed the takeoff, but the remaining animals were wobbly. The sleigh shook to the left and right. Henry, afraid it would flip, struggled to straighten it out, as Troy, riding in the sleigh next to him, kept yelling for Kiki and Mishka to settle down. Before they could really get going, Henry brought them back down to earth with a very bumpy landing, with the sleigh skipping up and down several times before coming to a stop. The original reindeer crew came running out onto the field as the animals attached to the sleigh argued and growled at one another. Millie, exasperated, said, "I'm not sure if I can do this. I'm not strong enough to be in the rear." Henry, Donner, and Blitzen assured them they could and would be able to do it, but Otis and Troy had doubts. Henry moved Garbo to the rear, and Millie moved up one. On their next run, the team did a couple of laps before going airborne. "Just follow Iman's legs. Don't stare at the ground," Corky yelled to Kiki when he noticed her eyes closing once more. "Great," Kiki sighed. "I'm getting orders from a pig." Once they landed safely, Henry gave them all a break and stayed seated in the sleigh with his hands over his face. They were days away from Christmas Eve. Santa wanted to take them up for a ride on the 23rd, and Henry feared they would never be ready. "Listen," Troy said. "Let me sit in the middle of the crew so Mishka can see my lips move and understand what she needs to do." "It's too dangerous," Henry said, trying to breathe. "It's too dangerous not to." Henry looked at Otis and Troy. "We're only as good as our weakest link," Otis and Troy said in unison. Santa strolled a jolly path around the sleigh. A discriminating eye sized up the varied crew of misfit animals. Each creature awaited his judgment. Henry trailed in his wake. A glance, a nod, and a twinkle in his eyes communicated the unspoken rapport between him and his eclectic team. With a dramatic flourish, Santa planted a boot upon the sleigh's step. His weight felt through the hopeful group. The reins found their place in his grasp as he settled in his seat. "I'll call your names in the order you stand. Bartholomew first, Francis last," Santa declared with the gravity of a conductor about to start playing with his orchestra. Bartholomew and Iman soared into the blue winter sky. The others followed without the same jump of Christmas. Hearts racing, throats dry. Santa's voice called instructions. He had them hit heights they had not achieved with Henry. Gripping the reins, he could feel the sleigh veering to the left and the crew losing the rhythm of their legwork. The ride, even to a pro like Santa Claus, was rough and choppy. Santa shouted orders as they flew fast and hard before heading back to base. It was a turbulent landing, marked by a resounding thud and a big bounce. The trial ride with Santa was good, but they were not reindeer ready. "You've given your best," he said to Henry and the crew, "but I'm sorry. I think it's unsafe." All 8 of the animals looked defeated, hanging heads and slumped shoulders, as did the reindeer. "It's not your fault. Pulling a flying sleigh takes years of practice." Santa looked at Henry, who was walking around the sleigh, comforting each of them. "Am I right, Donner?" Santa said. Donna did not reply out of respect for Henry and the team's efforts. "Can you tell us what to improve?" asked Garbo. Santa shook his head, then changed his mind. "The takeoff is not on the correct frequency. Bartholomew and Iman are great, but the next 6 need to move like an orchestra." Santa clapped his hands. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Santa walked with Henry to the front of the sleigh. "Look at me." They all looked up. "Thank you, all, for giving your best. We needed a miracle, and we almost got one." With that, Santa walked stoically away. Henry looked at his team. Tears ran down several of their faces. Henry turned and ran after Santa Claus. "Santa," he called. They watched as Henry energetically talked to Santa Claus. Santa shook his head no. With prayer hands, Henry pled his case, which none of the animals could hear. He didn't seem to accept the argument, but before he left, Santa whispered something to Henry, which sent him running back to the group. We have 24 hours. If we aren't ready, he will pull the plug tomorrow, Christmas Eve, on takeoff. But first, I want to say I'm so proud of you all. You've done outstanding. And if you want to stop now, there's no shame. I'll leave it up to you. Millie mooed. Francis pawed the ground. Look at me, Henry said. They all raised their heads high. Amen, said Bartholomew. Me too, Garbo said from the back. Francis and Millie nodded their heads. In, they yelled, as did Corky. Mishka motioned to Troy that she was in. They all waited for Kiki. I'm afraid of heights and flying, but if you want me, I'm in. The reindeer, birds, and other animals watching began to shriek with delight. Here's what we're going to do, Henry said. Christmas Eve, every elf, person, and animal in the area was out waving, supporting, and rooting for them to succeed. Henry stood in the sleigh. Troy attached a harness so he could go to the front and back, giving the team support, but mainly he sat in front of Mishka so she could read his lips. This year we have an unorthodox crew, Santa said, inspecting the team. I normally travel alone with the reindeer, but Henry, Troy, and Otis will travel with us this year. Santa climbed in the sleigh and called out, Bartholomew, Iman, Kiki, Corky, Mishka, Millie, Garbo, and Francis. The team began to run, picking up speed. Santa, we have an original song we'd like to sing to help us with the takeoff. Is that all right? Henry asked. Santa nodded to Henry, who started to clap and sing. Bartholomew and Iman quickly joined him. School is out, I've made my list, and now I'm ready for old Saint Nick. They leaped into the air with power and grace. Henry kept singing, and now joined by Kiki and Corky. Mom and Dad have trimmed the tree, and all the neighbors have decorated. Kiki and Corky jumped in perfect harmony in time. And now I'm waiting for Santa Claus, sang Millie and Troy, so that Mishka could see. Millie and Mishka left the ground in complete unison. Waiting for Santa Claus to come. Garbo and Francis hit the air with brilliant choreography, bringing the sleigh smoothly into the winter sky. The entire crew was singing loud and proud, and as their voices echoed in the night, the Rag Tag Sleigh Flyers flew with the spirit and determination to bring Christmas once more, making their journey and story the thing of legend. You have just listened to the Rag Tag Flyers.
I hope you enjoyed that story. Wasn't it wonderful? That'll be it for me today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all are taking care of yourself. I hope that you are being kind to one another, no matter who they are. I'll wrap up by saying don't forget to find us online and like and share and subscribe, whatever it is you do that helps this podcast get out. I greatly appreciate it. If you're able to support us in a financial way, every dollar goes back into the podcast to help upkeep with equipment and pod hosting, websites, purchasing books and things to read and discuss on the podcast. It's never expected, but thank you. There are links in the show notes that will direct you to my Ko-fi page where for a donation, I will send you a Christmas card this year with a bookmark and stickers. Thank you for donating. Thank you for your support and encouragement to help spread the coziness of Christmas. I'll end today by saying, let us remember to honor Christmas in our hearts and try to keep it all the year. Have a very Merry Christmas.